Hello. Welcome to the RISE webinar. My name is Tsepo Sitole, usually known by the name Teddy, and I'm the project coordinator at RISE International. Now I am with my co-host, Ree. Ree, hi.
Hi, Teddy. How are you?
Good, really good. Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, RISE is a non-profit social enterprise that operates in Lesotho, a landlocked country in South Africa. We focus on economic development through job creation, skills development, and entrepreneurship, specifically in the built environment, through a fellowship program called In Loco. The fellowship is a design, build, and entrepreneurship program for graduates who have studied architecture, construction management, civil and electrical engineering, plumbing and carpentry, among other disciplines. Now, the fellows, they get a hands-on learning experience while at the same time solving problems in infrastructure. We turn job seekers into job creators by helping them start their own businesses and taking them through a 3-year incubation program where we connect them with mentors, co-working space, tools, and clients, among other resources. Now, when designing and building a new house, you need to incorporate some energy efficient features that will not only make a huge difference in comfort and long-term cost savings, but it will also ensure that you are building a sustainable home that is friendlier to the environment. But what should you take into consideration in ensuring that your house will be energy efficient? Today, we're talking to Dr. Barnabas about designing and building energy efficient houses. Dr. Barnabas, hello.
Hello.
Hello, welcome, Doctor. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Barnabas is a historian of the relationship between architecture and energy through time. His book, Architecture from Prehistory to Climate Emergency, that was published by Pelican in 2021, has been acclaimed as one of the most significant architectural publications in recent years. Dr. Barnabas is a senior lecturer in architecture at the University of Liverpool. Doctor, I'd like to welcome you today to today's webinar, and I'd like to quickly hand over to Ree so that we can continue.
Thank you, Teddy. Thank you, Dr. Barnabas, once again. Thank you for joining us this afternoon or this morning, wherever it is everyone is watching us from. We'd like to just hand over to you to just give us basically what it is you'd like to say for the day. And if there's any questions whatsoever, the audience will be given that platform at the end of our discussion with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to talk to you today. I am, as you've said, a historian. So my approach is in some ways quite zoomed out, but also I think quite fundamental. So I know much less than I'd like to about the context in which you're working, and I'm very keen to learn from you today about the opportunities and challenges you face in trying to reach zero carbon, because lower carbon isn't quite enough, while still achieving the economic and social justice that's been so conspicuously lacking from the history of international relations over the centuries. Today, what I'm wanting to propose is that the modernist beloved saying, form follows function, needs updating for a generation that's facing the threat of catastrophic climate emergency. What we need to recognize is that, in fact, form follows fuel, that the energy, our food and our fuel, has always been and is now the biggest factor shaping human architecture. So, speaking as a historian in Britain and from Britain, I am today going to tell you the story, essentially, of how Britain and then Western Europe and America set the scene, in particular through our architecture, for the climate emergency that we're now facing. Then, after that, I'm keen to discuss with you where Southern Africa fits into these challenges. And the context of this is that countries, particularly countries rich in fossil fuel energy today, are using disastrous amounts of energy to build and run their buildings And most architecture in all countries has become heavily dependent on materials that cost a lot of fossil fuel energy to make. Concrete, steel, fired brick, tile, ceramics, plastics, and aluminium are the repertoire of so much construction internationally, and they are all really problematic materials in terms of their very intense energy use. So how did we get here from a situation where only 200 years ago, almost the whole world was building at zero carbon or close to it, and 500 years ago, everyone in the world was? And I think it's in the big sweep of history that you suddenly see with a new clarity how weird and how avoidable our current immense global energy use for the built environment is. So my book is structured around successive dominant energy systems, hunter-gatherer energy systems, agrarian energy systems, farming ones, and fossil fuel energy systems of the sort that now dominate the world. And the relationship between architecture and energy genuinely goes back as far as you can trace. The earliest building to leave substantial remains is this, excavated in what's now Ukraine, built 14,000 years ago. And it makes this link between energy and architecture in housing incredibly clear. It's actually built of food energy waste. It's built of the mammoth bones and reindeer hide from the mammoths and reindeer that they had gone there to hunt. And it's there in order to keep in the heat energy from their fire, which in itself burnt mammoth bones as fuel. So energy gave rise to every bit of this first traceable building. And that remains the pattern. Most of what gets discussed in architectural history surveys is squashed into the few millennia since the rise of agrarian states, and that is because it leaves much more remains. So that's over the last 6,000 years or so, where farming has been a significant part of human energy systems, and where political elites have managed to turn most people and domesticated animals into tools for maximizing energy output from the land. And by doing this, if you have a reliable water supply and fertile soil, you can support a very dense population indeed. And in these agrarian fertile societies, 80 to 95% of the population worked unpleasantly hard in the fields, living in poverty with a narrow, unhealthy diet to support a non-farming elite minority whose buildings make up most of the buildings you think of when you think of kind of grand architectural history. The more surplus food these farmers were able to grow, the more appallingly unequal their societies became. And the conditions of farmers themselves remained miserable, whilst the elite living off their labor became ever larger and more complex, living in grand homes, building enormous monuments, walling in their cities to control taxation. If form follows fuel, as I'm arguing, the new energy system unsurprisingly brought about new projects. And this is the mega projects of the agrarian elite, the huge buildings of these small minority of powerful people. So here is a major Chinese pagoda of 1,000 years ago, built, shown to the same scale as the mammoth bone house that I showed in the first image. Here is a major Roman temple, the Pantheon in Rome, shown again to the same scale. And here is the Pyramid of Khufu, perhaps the biggest of all agrarian monuments, the burial place of a pharaoh, again shown to the same scale. Agrarian architecture was shaped by twin realities that for the powerful, labor was very, very cheap. From 1800 BCE to 1300 CE, across a wide range of agrarian societies, the historian Walter Scheidel has shown that almost all saw rates of pay for unskilled laborers somewhere around subsistence level, where the worker could feed themselves from their pay, but couldn't feed a family reliably unless other members of the family earned food too. And at these prices, the rich in Song Dynasty China, or ancient Rome or ancient Egypt could afford to build on this enormous scale, as could the French cathedral builders who owned a lot of farmland. Form follows fuel. But all this labor is of limited use because human muscles are so pathetically weak. The 78 million days of labor that one academic estimates that it took to build the pyramid of Khufu equate in terms of modern energy use to less than the lifetime energy consumption of 7 average Americans today. In other words, an average contemporary extended family in North America, Europe, or Australasia controls energy resources equivalent to the handful of most powerful rulers of the ancient world. It's an extraordinary situation. What was not cheap, even for the very powerful in history's earlier agrarian economies, was heat. Heat was expensive because industry, cooking, and heating all needed to be served by slow-growing firewood, supplemented in some contexts by burning other things, but firewood was the main one in many regions. Cooking is non-negotiable. Humans can't survive long-term on exclusively raw food, and the firewood grown to meet those needs took up land that could otherwise be used for food and was always scarce and expensive. Energy historians have a term for this, which is a really useful one, the photosynthetic constraint. And it's the concept that there's a limit on the energy available to pre-fossil fuel societies set by the amount of energy their crops and trees could harness from the sun every year. This had immense implications for their economies and their architecture. If you think about an industry like glass making, the modern pattern is that the more you do, the cheaper it gets. If, however, you have limited firewood supplies, the more you do, the more you drive up the price of firewood until it's too expensive to sell more glass. And that means that even the very rich 500 years ago in Liverpool, where I am talking from, had to live, they were exceptionally privileged to have glass in their windows, which is necessary to stay warm and have light in most seasons in a country like Britain, which is cold much of the year and was colder then. But the quality of the glass is terrible. This is really, really poor quality glass by modern standards because the industry was small and inexpert. Once you got coal coming in, it became the case that the more you did, the cheaper it got. And the implications of this for architecture, of these enormous amounts of cheap heat, have been truly enormous. Firstly, they've been enormous even beyond architecture, that countries that happened to sit above easily mined coal supplies tended to become industrially wealthy and often shamefully used that wealth to invade, steal, murder, and enslave in pursuit of still greater wealth and the raw materials to keep their coal-fired industry machinery busy and their urban working classes fed. And the inequalities set up by those early generations of fossil fuels are still enormously important in shaping the world today, very much for the worse. For architecture, this amount of cheap heat reshaped what people did and what people built with. So we today, as a world, routinely use levels of energy for making building materials that the world could not possibly have afforded within that photosynthetic constraint, the limits of what energy you could grow. To sustainably furnish the world's current energy consumption just for cement production, using the dominant agrarian source of intense heat, which was charcoal from wood, would require the entire output of an area of coppiced woodland larger than Australia, just for cement. If you put it as human labor, it's even more ridiculous. To furnish enough energy to provide our cement energy supply would require a group of healthy adult men working 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, every week of the year, and the group would have to be 4.7 times larger than the entire population of the Earth today, man, woman, and child. And that's just for the energy we put into cement production. Steel would add more than the same again. Plastics, aluminium, glass, brick, ceramics, tile would all add more and more to this ridiculous, unimaginable amount of human labor that would be required to be the equivalent. So in these circumstances, whilst the social injustice of much of the agrarian world was really revolting, its self-restraint on heat inputs can be really cheering. as we currently try to get away from fossil fuels. If you look at a building like the Baths of Caracalla in Rome, shown here to the same scale as the Pyramid of Khufu, to show that it's a very large building, it was built with such solidity that most of it is still there after nearly 2,000 years of being plundered for materials and neglected. And this extraordinary solidity was achieved using very low heat inputs and materials sourced very locally. 76% of the volume of materials for this enormous building was extracted within 20 kilometers of the site. And under 6% of the volume was made up of materials that required heat to make, which were brick and lime. Today's buildings, by contrast, in most of the world are largely composed of materials requiring huge heat inputs and transported around the planet using very cheap diesel. Form follows fuel. So fossil fuels have changed everything, and fully half of my book is devoted to the very small period of time in which they've come to transform increasingly the entire world, asymmetrically, unevenly, unjustly, but ubiquitously now. In Britain, it's really hard to see them almost because we've had them for so long that it feels as though they are just how the world is. Britain's been dependent on fossil energy since the 17th century, when coal produced the Georgian house, coal-fired brick walls, coal-made glass, coal-forged iron building tools, nails, hinges, and so on. And these advantages, technical advantages, were enough to make it worth coping with the choking, filthy coal smoke that came to characterize British cities and were always commented on by people coming from abroad. With fossil fuels, heat became extremely cheap, and with the steam engine, as seen at St Pancras Station here in London, the cheap heat could replace muscle power for an increasing range of tasks as labour costs rose with material living standards. And so the long-standing pattern that labour was cheap and heat was expensive was quickly reversed in places that had fossil fuels to exploit, radically changing the materials, construction practices, and operation of buildings. The total amount of energy was vastly greater with coal. A pre-modern agrarian farming family could typically harvest around 1.2 times what they themselves consumed, whereas Victorian coal miners could extract 500 times more energy than they consumed, meaning that they were 2,500 times more productive in terms of the energy usable for something other than their own lives. In coal-built industrial cities like the one in which I am, Liverpool, Victorian and Edwardian buildings explored the new technologies and services made possible by fossil fuels. Entire buildings made of metal, entire buildings of concrete structure, concrete and steel structure, air conditioning and heating systems like this from the 1850s in Liverpool's wonderful St George's Hall concert hall. And city size exploded. This is Liverpool in 1836, after more than 100 years of industrial revolution. But the steam engine has just started to run railways at this date. You can see the first intercity railway in the world as the dotted line there. And so over the following 60 years, that little blob of energy consumption on the left and the city on the right expand extraordinarily explosively. The aesthetics of modernism, which have come to be seen as the sort of standard world architecture by many, arose from the thrillingly overheated reaction of gifted young people in Italy, the USSR, France, and elsewhere to their own country's fast-moving second-generation fossil fuel revolutions. And the things they came up with, like beautiful white modernist villas of the 1920s and 30s, allowed a new level of openness to the landscape through huge windows, terraces, and roof gardens, and liberatingly open plan interiors. But this was only possible through energy-hungry concrete, steel, and glass to build them, and enormous inputs of fossil fuel central heating in order to keep them at all comfortable in cool or cold weather. Form follows fuel, and these are buildings that are as much about central heating as they are about any of the other things that people talk about with them. Planning too changed radically with cars and newly affordable construction materials. So Le Corbusier and others looked at giant reinforced concrete and glass factories like the Fiat Lingotto car plant with its racetrack on the roof and felt incredibly excited about the possibility that the notion of ground level was maybe a thing of the past. Why couldn't you, with concrete, steel and glass, have roads, gardens, pedestrian routes and buildings weaving themselves around each other like spaghetti with complete design freedom? At the Barbican in London housing estate, they did it 50 years later. And for the first time in history, it became common for interiors to have no natural supply of fresh air or light at all. There are spaces in the bottom of this section where you can see rooms for hundreds of people, which are several rooms away from light or air, and you would die in them if the electricity supply went for long enough. And no one even thinks of it now. So via modernism, I think that energy profligacy, wasteful expenditure of energy is built deeply into the DNA of today's architectural theories and practices. Indeed, you could argue that the very concept of modernity is the spread of fossil fuel economics and culture around the world. So at the moment, the design and construction industries globally remain trapped squarely within fossil fuels and are indeed expanding their use of them. Concrete and steel remain ubiquitous, natural first choice materials, despite their terrible carbon footprints. I don't say this in a spirit of blame. We've all got snarled up in a fossil fuel world culture, which has brought benefits as well as problems. But we do need to now find a way of reaching zero carbon. I would love to know from you in the discussion we're about to have how you feel about the climate emergency and about architecture's response to it. Western Europe, North America, and other regions have profited so asymmetrically from the rise of fossil fuels, and those profits have supported terrible international injustices. Now, as the economic benefits of fossil fuels are becoming increasingly felt in other parts of the world, we are confronted with a climate emergency which requires us to escape from our dependency on both fossil fuels and cement. How do we do so in a way that doesn't worsen existing injustice and poverty and still allows it to be the situation to be improved? I normally give talks about my book to universities and other groups in countries with decades or centuries of fossil fuel wealth behind them and very wasteful present use of energy for buildings. The message for me is easy there. I tell them essentially that we are killing people by our ridiculous self-indulgence and greed, and that it is easy for us to cut our emissions very sharply if we just have the willpower and impose the regulations to do it. But I do this from a country that's very energy wealthy. The average person in Britain uses well over 10 times as much energy each year as the average person in Lesotho. So what can people in Lesotho or in other less well-off countries do? What should you do? What can be done to escape from concrete, steel, and fossil fuel energy whilst providing good housing, good education, health, and employment for everyone? What do you think are the biggest challenges you face in decarbonizing your building sector? Are there lessons that can be learnt locally from pre-fossil fuel architecture in your region about other ways of achieving good comfort conditions in new buildings? And what materials you could potentially bring to bear that are not as heat intense as concrete and steel? Should new buildings in Lesotho look and operate the same as new buildings in, say, London or Alaska or Singapore? Or should buildings in different parts of the world look very different according to their local materials and climates? How can the world move towards greater justice, better housing, and less inequality without, in the process, scaling up carbon emissions to the point where we make our planet uninhabitable? So there are a few small, easy questions to get the discussion going. I'm really keen to hear your views on these things rather than just being a talking head. So I put myself in the hands of our chairs today, and thank you very much for your attention to my opening comments.
Thank you very much, Dr. Barnabas. I can imagine that everyone else feels as strongly as Teddy and I that was very insightful. And we'd at this point then just like to jump into the questions for the day. We'd like to know, what does the term green building mean?
It's a problematic one because it's vague, and therefore you can claim all sorts of things as green building, and that is potentially it's certainly something that happens a lot in the development industry and the construction industry in Britain, that you pass an enormous concrete building being constructed, and on the sign outside it says this is the most sustainable new office development in the city, and you know it's a ridiculous lie, but because they're using these vague terms, sustainable and green, there isn't actually a way of legally challenging it. They're meaningless words to some extent. What they should mean is being built in such a way that they do not reduce the probability of future generations having a tolerable quality of life. And that means, in particular, at the moment, one of the biggest challenges is carbon, and getting as close to zero carbon as you can. So zero carbon for me is a more useful term because it's directly measurable, and you can work out what materials have gone into the building and what their carbon cost was to make and what their carbon cost was to transport, and then you can find out whether that adds up to zero or not. I'll give you a clue, it doesn't. In almost any building at the moment going up in across most of the world, there's very little zero carbon building at the moment, and we need to move to entirely zero carbon building, given that we don't have the methods for carbon offsetting that would allow us to continue splurging on carbon. But I genuinely see this as a problem that that the countries that have done the most damage and ended up with the most money from doing it should be leading on in some ways, because the expensive bits of developing new low carbon technologies should be done by the people who caused the problem and have the money. And it shouldn't be it shouldn't be used as either a deliberate or accidental tool for reducing development in places that need it much more. So it's a really difficult one.
All right, thank you for that distinguishment. I'll just let Teddy carry on at this point.
Dr. Barnabas, thank you for that very informative and insightful presentation. And those are some very interesting questions that you posed in there, and I hope that we'll be able to address them as you continue with the webinar. But Dr. Barnabas, I'd like to find out from you, why should people take note of green buildings? I mean, you did say a bit earlier that there were some expensive materials. Some of them might be expensive. That can only be used by people who have privilege, such as glass houses. But why should people take note of green buildings?
Because at the moment, 39% of all human climate change emissions are coming from buildings. And if therefore every other sector fully decarbonized and we carried on the way we're doing at the moment, we would cause catastrophic climate change with disastrous implications for our own species and every other species. So we cannot possibly afford as a planet, this is now incredibly clear from the climate science consensus, we cannot continue to build the way we are doing. The worst offenders are the richest countries who build more and build more wastefully and build more things that they just don't need to build, and demolish really good, robust buildings to build slightly larger ones in order to make a profit. So these are the people to shut down fastest in their immoral activities. But worldwide, we do need to find solutions to energy consumption that mean that we don't, as conditions improve in poorer countries, design in a level of fossil fuel dependency that means that improving conditions are inevitably improving carbon emissions, because we cannot afford the world's carbon emissions to be anything like what they are now. We've also been singled out as a sector, the building sector, the construction and running of buildings, has been singled out by one of the authors of the latest IPCC report, which is the most authoritative international survey of climate change. And one of its authors has written an article especially about architecture to make it clear to us that we are, of all the sectors in the world, the one that is adapting least well to the challenge of reducing carbon emissions. And that, for me, I was really upset by the extent to which the architecture world in Britain and America, whose media I follow, didn't really discuss it. I think it's just too painful, too embarrassing, requires too radical a change. And so they just didn't mention it. And it should be the key headline across the architectural world, and it's not being given attention.
Thank you, Doctor. So you'd like for a lot of people to be informed about energy use and green buildings. And does this have anything to do with leadership in energy and environmental design, LEED, and what is it exactly?
It's an assessment system. There are a range of assessment systems internationally for architecture, and they are there is controversy around them because they have a tendency to give good scores to buildings that are not anywhere close to the level of change that's required in order to avoid climate catastrophe. And therefore, they have been accused of greenwashing, as it's known, where you are deliberately covering up bad environmental practice by a sort of marketing exercise of pretending you're doing the right thing. I'm not going to say in a recorded session what, and I don't have the expertise to give a kind of categorical personal opinion on this, but I think the reality is unequivocally that some of the leading environmental assessment schemes, and I would include LEED and BREEAM in that. BREEAM is the British-based equivalent. I would say that they are not judging buildings in a way that is producing the right outcomes in terms of sustainability. So they therefore potentially are part of the problem rather than part of the solution, because to people who are not experts in the topic, hearing that a new building has been given an outstanding mark in an environmental assessment scheme should mean that you can relax about its environmental performance. And if they are giving those awards to buildings that are performing in a way that if everyone built the same, we would wipe ourselves out, then that's a real problem. And they currently are giving awards that sound very flattering to buildings that we cannot afford to keep building like that. So I think they are really problematic.
All right, thank you for that insightful explanation. I think one interesting question we would want to find out is, can we learn lessons about the future of sustainable or green architecture from the architectural past?
Yes, I think it's a very, very good place to look for ideas and materials, because for the whole of our history where we didn't have cheap heat, we found the materials nearby that we could turn into the best housing we could manage and the best buildings we could manage, and we used it in ways that didn't require any fossil fuel inputs at all. And therefore, a first step towards thinking about materials that might that might enable us to get away again from concrete and steel is to look backwards and sideways to see how we kept ourselves comfortable and safe in our own climate, using our own locally grown or extracted materials in conditions that that didn't have all this cheap fossil fuel energy. So stone is an enormously valuable replacement material for concrete because it does most of the things concrete does without having to be heat processed and can often be locally sourced. Wood is very strong in places that easily grow lots of wood. Various forms of plant matter can be brought back into use for things like thatches that, whilst they require more maintenance than a tile roof, are also much more sustainable at every stage of their life. They take carbon out of the atmosphere in the first place, and then at the end of their life, they just go back into the soil. Whereas getting rid of tiles at the end of their life, you just have to crush them up and turn them into road surface because they're so durable. So I think there are enormous lessons to be learned by looking backwards and working out. I'm not suggesting that everybody goes back to pre-modern ways of living, not at all, but that with our contemporary deep materials science understanding of what you can do with materials and our extraordinary ability with computer modeling and all sorts of other useful technologies, we learn some of the principles that kept our architecture viable in the past and adapt them to be parts of our architecture in the future.
Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Barnabas, I'd like to find out from you, how can owners improve their property's energy efficiency?
It depends what the energy inefficiency of your property is in the first place. So in Britain, where I am, the biggest problem is keeping warm. In long, sort of 3/4 of the year, it's cold enough that you quite like to have a bit of extra heat. And most of our houses are enormously inefficient in keeping it in. And it's quite a difficult problem to solve because you can cause damp problems if you add insulation in clumsy ways. But if you are using much in the way of heating, then improving the insulation of the house is hugely valuable for reducing energy use. So is wearing a bit more clothing and just dealing with slightly lower temperatures for people in much of the rich world where they overheat their houses crazily. If you're dealing with too much heat, designing out sun entry to the house is a huge step. So the American and British and European image of a kind of what a modern house looks like tends to have lots of window and not very much shading. If you do that somewhere with warm sun, then you produce an intensely hot interior. And there are two ways of dealing with it, one of which is to change the amount of sun that gets in, and the other is to use lots and lots of air conditioning. And very obviously, one of those is a good idea, and the other one is a terrible idea because air conditioning is very, very energy hungry. So those designing your buildings or retrofitting your buildings to minimize their requirements for heating and air conditioning is a really good idea. Thinking too about lighting. With LEDs, it's much less of a problem than it used to be because the energy demands of LED lighting is very small, but you can still think about daylight and what different areas will be used for and how much daylight they need. And you can also actively generate energy from your housing, which is a fantastically good thing to do. So if everyone put solar or photovoltaic panels on their roofs, the amount of energy generated by it becomes enormous. So I would strongly encourage governments to support that kind of initiative, but also individuals to pursue it. And I think the other, I suppose another fairly major source of energy consumption is cooking, and there are more efficient and less efficient ways of doing it. It's not one of the top tiny percent of polluters in the world, but cooking, you can move to more efficient cooking devices, and if you do, it does improve energy efficiency.
Thank you, Doctor. And now, Doctor, you mentioned a bit earlier that there's ways in which you can regulate, or at least try to ensure that the house has enough conditioning. Only by designing it that way, in order to conserve energy as well. Right now in Lesotho, we're going into our winter. So I'd like to find out from you, how can we ensure that the building is designed in such a way that, in winter it's warm and in summer it's a bit cooler as well?
Yeah, it's a really, it's an incredibly local challenge that every region and every altitude within that region has its own answer to that question, because the challenges it's facing are different. But the key things that, the key variables are how much sun gets in and how much heat gets out. And those, between the two seasons, the two types of energy problem, of heating, too much heat and too little heat, those are really powerful answers. Quite a lot of things you do in a house already produce heat. So all electronic devices, all cooking, all washing with warm water, and human bodies themselves all produce heat all the time. So in winter, if you have a well enough insulated house, it can potentially produce all the heat you need to get through even quite a cool winter, without having to have heating on top of it. But to do so, you have to have a house that's so well insulated that you better be pretty careful that there's no sun getting in summer, or it will become intolerably hot. So there's a really, it's something that architects and all building professionals need to become really sophisticated about, not in kind of general terms, but in specific understanding of the area in which they work. Because the challenge in Britain is dealing with a combination of a wet climate and a kind of consistently slightly cold climate, except that the summers are getting warmer and there's quite a lot of long hours of sunlight from a lot of angles because we're so far north. And therefore, overheating in very well insulated houses is now becoming a problem for the small number of very well insulated houses we have. And so really designing from the start in any new house, thinking about its passive warmth and cooling right from the start is the most important factor. And with any house that's already there, making sure that any new insulation is done in such a way that it doesn't cause new problems to the house, particularly from damp, because if, for example, you insulate most of a house but you miss a bit, then that bit of the house is like taking a cool drink out of the fridge and suddenly it covers in condensation because it's cold and takes the water out of the atmosphere. And if there's only one bit of your house that's cold, it will get all the water from your house's atmosphere and all the water from cooking and washing, and it will attract it to there and rot. And that damages your house and damages your health. And so insulation is a skills business that requires really serious thought about whether there are any bits that are going to let the cold through. And similarly, sun shading, it's a challenge to make sure that you are shading the correct windows, the correct amount at the correct times of year. Ideally, you have a solution that means that you can gain some sun heat in winter, because that can again get rid of your need for heating. But the crucial thing is to avoid dangerous levels of overheating in summer, because that can be fatal.
Thank you, Doctor. Doctor, I should have taken this opportunity a bit earlier when you were talking about the LEED, the Leadership in Energy and Developmental Design. I'd like to find out, is there any an efficient energy health check that you can do, apart from using LED?
That's a really good question, and I should have a really good answer to it, and I don't. There are a lot of systems, and I assume that some of them are pretty good. If you're designing a building, a really good thing to do is a life cycle carbon analysis, where you look at the materials and how they get transported and built, and then you look at how the building will operate, and then, which you can model on a computer, and then you look at what will happen at the end of the building's life and how the pieces of the building will go away and become something else. And you work out the carbon cost of each of those stages, and then you can see where your big problems are. And so, for example, you might realize that the fact that you've put a basement in with concrete tanking has meant that you've doubled the lifetime carbon of the building just from that one move, and so you get rid of it. But so from a design point of view, a really good life cycle carbon analysis is a really good thing that should be the aspiration for architects wherever possible. In terms of measuring performance, I don't have a clear answer to that. The key thing, obviously, I mean, the helpful thing with energy consumption is that operational energy consumption, in other words, heating, lighting, cooking, and cooling, is that you get an energy bill for it. And therefore you can see very quickly whether last year's energy bills are better or worse than this year's, because after you've made an intervention and put shutters in to keep the sun off in summer, or put more insulation in to keep the winter warmer.
Right, thank you, Doctor. I think we have room for one more question from us as the host of the webinar, and then we can open the floor to the audience. So as I'm talking, can people just type their question in the chat box, or either on Facebook if you're watching us from live, wherever you are. Thanks for joining us this afternoon, this morning. We are talking about energy in buildings with Dr. Barnabas, who has so kindly offered his hour. I think what we'd want to know is, from our standpoint as Lesotho, what could the government do for not just us, but in other low-income countries as well, to boost energy efficiency in buildings? And if it's possible for them to intervene in any way, do you think that it should be included in the building and planning laws and legislation?
I think yes, I think it should. I think it's a really it's a much tougher one to balance than for countries with a lot more wealth, because if you stop Russian oligarchs from laundering their dirty money building department stores in central London, you're not causing any evil at all by stopping that unnecessary and carbon intense process. Whereas if you are affecting the provision of housing to people who need better housing as a matter of priority, that is a much more challenging set of decisions to make. So I think it needs to be done with really good faith, and with really good motivations and real care and thought. But I think one of the ways to encourage change is to not try and do it overnight, but to give yourself a few years and to say that by the following date, we would like all new buildings getting constructed to have the following qualities, or to have the following maximum amount of concrete in them, or whatever it is. So I think there are things that they could do to improve, to encourage positive change. I'm sure there would also be funding available to some extent internationally for projects that, for example, increase the amount of solar photovoltaic energy production, or that produced solutions to some of these problems in a way that would then be scalable, because these are the same problems everyone's facing in different forms. So it's not a situation where I think people, poorer people in less well-off countries shouldn't be left bearing the economic cost of changes that are required, not because of their historic energy use, but because of the very rich people in the world's historic energy use. And one of the great challenges isn't with your government, but it's with our governments and our electorates of getting us to recognize that we owe environmental reparations to the world, and we should be subsidizing environmental improvements in countries that are less able to pay for them themselves, at the cost of us spending less money on stuff we don't need, because of a kind of internal competition within the country about how rich you are, which is just a terrible, terrible way of producing the carbon emissions we have in this country. So I don't have a kind of a sort of desire to stomp into other countries and tell their governments what to do, because we are so much worse here that you know I have no possible moral authority to advise anyone outside the most energy wasting countries in the world in which I live what they should be doing.
All right, thanks for that clarification, Doctor. I'm going to hand over to Teddy while we still wait for the audience to please leave any comments, queries, suggestions in the chat box. Whether you're watching us on Zoom or on Facebook, we'd love to hear what you have to say and engage with you, because we have these conversations to find out more from you. Teddy, over to you.
Thank you so much, Rui. Doctor, you mentioned a fundraising opportunity there, actually a grant. I'd just like to let everyone know that's attending right now that UNDP, through its Lesotho Accelerator Lab, is hosting a climathon aimed at soliciting solutions that the country can use to combat the challenge it is facing in climate change, environment, and energy. So the climathon is a basic hackathon on action against environment and climate changes. So I'll be sharing this link in the chat box so that any local people that are interested in applying for this grant can be able to access it. So I will be sharing it. Also, let us know what you think of this webinar, and also what kind of topics you want us to discuss in the future. I'll also be dropping a link in the chat box. Dr. Barnabas, I'd like to ask you, while we're waiting for the audience to send in their questions, would you suggest rather natural or rather other materials that we can use, recycled or natural materials?
Yeah, I mean, it's fairly simple in a way that if it requires heat to process it, that heat will currently be coming overwhelmingly from fossil fuels, because that is the cheap source of heat. And therefore, if you can substitute a material that required heat, swap it out for a material that doesn't require heat, then that's a good thing to do. So it's not it doesn't require the level of expertise that it might look as though it requires from a distance. If you see a building site that is that has a large amount of diesel machinery on it producing a large concrete and steel building, you can tell that whatever they say about it being sustainable, it will have an enormous initial carbon footprint to build. And that is that's just the way architecture is around the world now. Because these materials are very good in other respects. They are excellent materials, but that kind of critical problem at their heart is enormously frightening. And of course, the world's concrete industry has a turnover of trillions, or certainly many billions of dollars, which they don't want to stop having, very understandably. But I don't know how we avoid the marketing industry that they are able to subsidize from continuing to confuse and hush up this part of our of the world's carbon footprint. So keep it simple, use materials that don't use heat, and bring them together in a way that that doesn't require more energy to run than it has to. And that it's very complex in practice doing those two things, but in theory that's all that's required for a zero carbon architecture. You use zero heat materials moved by electric vehicles in the future, once those have got a bit better, and once we've got more renewable electricity generation through sun and water and wind, and architecture can become completely zero carbon.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you so much. Doctor, you also mentioned, reaching out to at least, trying to convince the government in order to partake in constructing buildings that can save energy. So I'd like to find out, what did you mean by that? Did you mean that maybe this should be included by the planning committees in the governments and by the planning ministry as well? Should this be included in their laws and legislature?
Cautiously, I would say ideally so, but I'm talking to you from a country whose considerable wealth should allow us to be leaders in this, and the fact that we sort of started the problem by having the Industrial Revolution start here, because we happened to have the coal near the surface close to cities, which therefore made it very easy to transition to extensive coal use. But that, rather than taking a leadership in it, we still don't even require new building projects to count how much carbon they are going to cost, let alone to reduce it. So we are in such a bad position with this here, with our enormous turnover of buildings, where we have several hundred years of robust fireproof structures that we could reuse from built with fossil fuels. And rather than reuse them, we pull them down and replace them because it's profitable to do so. We even have a tax system, which means that in Britain, you are taxed for adding to or improving an existing building. You are taxed for making environmental improvements to a new building at 20% of your cost. Whereas to build a new building, tax is either 0% or 5%. So you get a 40% subsidy essentially for demolishing and replacing a building before you've started anything else, just from the tax regime, which is insane. It's completely insane. I don't know what your own equivalent regulations are, but I would, if I were in a position to change a country's legislation, I probably wouldn't start with yours. I would start with ours, because we are much worse offenders for much less good reasons. So I think looking for ways in which to encourage the good practice is vital everywhere, and looking for ways not to end up joining Britain in its environmental crimes as your material conditions improve is really good, and it's really important. But yeah, I just don't feel that that I can sort of swoop in via Zoom and say, you must have a law that all buildings must be zero carbon from tomorrow, because it's not realistic, and it wouldn't be at all fair.
That is true. Thank you so much, Doctor. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. Time flies when you're having fun. Time really flies when you're having a good time. Thank you so much to Dr. Barnabas, who's currently joining us from the University of Liverpool today. Dr. Barnabas, as I said a bit earlier, he is a historian of the relationship between architecture and energy through time. Now, do get this book. It's called Architecture from Prehistory to Climate Emergency. It was released by Pelican in 2021. For those of you who are just joining us right now, Dr. Calder was just taking us through the things that you should be aware of when designing and building a new house, incorporating energy efficient features in it, and in order to make sure that you have those long-term cost savings, as well as ensuring that you are building a sustainable home that is friendlier to the environment. Taking consideration the construction materials and the methods that you are constructing that house with, the insulation, the windows and glazing, the lighting, using LED, and as well as the appliances that you use in your own home, in order to ensure that you at least reduce the carbon footprint that we have on the environment. Thank you very much to everyone who attended. Ensure that you follow Dr. Barnabas on Twitter or Instagram. That's at Barnabas Calder on Twitter or on Instagram. And you're welcome to also watch the recording of this webinar. We'll be releasing it soon on YouTube. So make sure to subscribe to our channel on YouTube. Thank you very much for joining us. And we'll see you again next month on the 26th of May. Remember that we have these webinars at the end of every month, on the last Thursday of every month. So next month we'll be talking to perhaps plastic and other players in the circular economy to talk about how you can actually use recycled materials and actually start a company or make a living out of it. And also disseminating that information in recycling and circular economy. So thank you so much for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Hi, everyone. Bye, Dr. Barnabas. Thank you.
Thanks.